I'm Father David Mickiewicz at the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception with my colleague Jasper, and today we are talking about Massimo Recalcati's Cain's Act, the origin of hatred.
Well, intentionally or not, this has been a recurring theme for us here at the Cathedral. We had Rabbi Ornstein here last Lent, who discussed his book, Cain versus Abel. You've done a production here at the Cathedral in Christ the King, Voices of the Torah. Why? Why this book? Why is this story so relevant? Why does it keep coming back?
The story of Cain and Abel, as well as the surrounding stories of creation, expulsion, the Noah and the flood, the Tower of Babel, are ancient primordial stories in the book of Genesis. They predate the Hebrew peoples, and they've been told for centuries and millennia. They incorporate, very much like Greek and Roman mythology, themes that are consistently happening over and over again and resonating with the human experience.
So, for those who might be unfamiliar with the story, can you just give us a brief synopsis of what is the story of Cain and Abel?
Cain and Abel are the sons of Adam and Eve. Abel ends up being a shepherd. Cain is a tiller of the soil. They both offer sacrifice to God. Abel, the firstlings of his flocks, the first of the crop. And for whatever reason, God accepts Abel's sacrifice and doesn't accept Cain's. All we know from the story is Cain walks out into the fields with Abel. They're having a conversation, which is not recorded, and rises up against Abel and murders him. God comes looking and asking where Abel is. Cain takes no responsibility. Am I my brother's keeper? Well, the answer is no. And Cain is punished by wandering into the land of Nod.
We discussed this when Rabbi was here. I think one of my favorite parts of the story is this idea of what does Cain say to Abel? And I know it doesn't say in Scripture, but what do you think the conversation possibly was?
Well, the nice part is the Hebrew kind of just peters off. It's not a complete sentence. And so sages and rabbis and theologians and scholars we can fill in a whole lot. Is Cain got his arm around his brother and they're talking about sports and walking out in the fields? And does he bring up the whole aspect of the sacrifice? Does jealousy and envy is part of the conversation? We don't know, as you've alluded to. And I think the fact that the sentence is not complete allows for our imagination to fill in in a multiple ways that express the different situations that happen between siblings, family members, friends, before a horrendous act of violence takes place.
What do you see at the root of the violence? I think the book centers on one theme, and that is envy. Do you agree with that? And if so, why? Why is envy so damaging, I guess, to human nature?
I would agree. It's envy, jealousy. Cain is jealous of Abel. God has accepted his sacrifice and not his. But that's not the first time this appears in the stories. It appears in the garden where Adam and Eve are told the whole universe is at their feet except for the fruit of one tree. And when the serpent tempts them, what he basically says is the reason why God doesn't want you to partake of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil is because then you'll be like God. So there's envy on the part of Adam and Eve to want to be like God. There's envy on the part of Cain over God's rejection of his gifts and acceptance of Abel. That continues on throughout the sacred scriptures. in various forms.
There's two quotes in the book that I have written down here. One is, man is not driven only by a desire to know what God knows, but by a desire to be God. And the other is, the drawing of boundaries kindles our desire to transgress them, which is one of my favorites. I like the idea of transgressing boundaries. What's our dislike with that? What's our discomfort there?
The two are linked together. To be God is to be limitless. But we're not God, we're creature. Creatures by nature are limited. You put on top of that someone else from the outside limiting us, such as the universe is at your feet, except for the fruit of one tree. We can't abide by that. The first time you start correcting a child, they fight against it. Even when we limit ourselves, such as choosing not to eat certain things to lose weight, what's the first thing we crave? You know, a woman who's pregnant has to say no to certain things to have a healthy pregnancy, to smoking, to alcohol, to certain foods. Why do we transgress speed limits? Transgress.
I don't.
Of course not. None of us do. We know we need law, but yet we dislike law because law, at least in our culture, in Anglo-Saxon culture and law limits. You can only go so fast. You can't turn here. So we think we can be not like God, but God, controlling every aspect of our lives. And we can't. We even see God doing self-limitation when God becomes a human being in Jesus of Nazareth. But it's by choice. But even when we choose to limit ourselves, how often do we break those limitations? We just don't like to be told what to do.
There's a passage here in the book. God bars man from knowing everything because he made him man, and as such not self-sufficient, incapable of self-generating, excluded from an absolute condition of fullness. How does that factor into this idea of consumerism that we have in society?
Consumerism tells us we can have everything we want. Listen to the vocabulary that's used. You deserve this. You know, what are sales all about? You know, you can afford this. You should have it. It's going to make your life better. The reality is we can't have everything. We can't afford everything. Or even if we can afford it, do we need it? Is it really going to make us happier? Which then leads to the question of what is happiness? What is being satisfied? And we don't really, as human beings, at least in our culture, want to deal with those kind of questions.
And because in my mind, as you're saying that, what I hear is circling back to envy. Envying what the other has. And that's the whole point is, and a big theme of the book is other. This idea of otherness. And the other can be those consumeristic things. You know, someone's got a bigger house, a better car, a newer car. They are live in a more affluent neighborhood. But otherness can also be race. It can be LGBTQ. It can be immigrants. It can be refugees, asylum seekers. What is our fear of those things?
I think the two examples you gave are slightly two different things. I look at someone with a bigger house, a better job, and what I see when I come across them is someone who's happy, but I don't experience them behind closed doors. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what the reality is. The grass always looks greener on the other side. And because the grass seems to be greener on the other side, I don't take into effect the good things that I have,
Right.
and relish them. The other example you gave of people, for whatever reason, we fear people not only that we don't know, but are different than us. I always found it intriguing in all of our sci-fi movies, the creatures from outer space don't look like us, and we always fight against them, starting with War of the Worlds.
Mm-hmm.
They bring some, they're out to destroy us. They're, we think the worst. And I think we're imposing upon that literature in those movies our fundamental reaction to each other, that's different. And it's different, as you said, by race. You're darker or lighter than me. Your eyes are almond shaped and mine are more open. Your hair is kinky and mine is straight. You love men and I love women. You don't know who to love, or who you care for. Your sense of self is different than mine. It's not just male or female. It's something different and in between. And a lot of it goes to ignorance. I'm ignorant, or maybe ignorance isn't the right word, but I don't have that experience.
Well, let me stop you there for a second. I think that's an important distinction you made about ignorance, is we've applied this negative connotation to it. But I don't know that ignorance implies a negativity. Ignorance simply means not knowing, or you hear that expression, ignorance is bliss. But I think we've applied this negative connotation to it because we've weaponized it in a way.
Okay.
If I called you ignorant, I think you would take great offense to that.
Yes, I would. Which is different than saying, well, you're not knowledgeable about something.
Mm-hmm.
Or you haven't had this experience. You're right. We've put a certain connotation on the word ignorant. And I think whether we like it or not, that's the connotation that's in our culture right now. But whether unknowledgeable, unexperienced, or ignorant about another person, another people, another situation, for whatever reason, that all leads to fear and to violence, often in one form or another.
Which brings us back to the theme of the book, of course, is the envy, the fear, ignorance, if you will, all brings it back to violence. And it's this, the book talks a little bit about instinct versus temptation, separates us from this kind of animal need versus human desire. It also talks a little bit about privilege. There's a whole lot of words that we hear a lot in society now, this idea of privilege and ignorance and fear. How do we apply this story to today?
Cain seems to be, he is unknowledgeable about God. God has made a decision. God has made a choice. God, or Cain, as well as us, don't know why. I've always had a problem with this. Why does Abel, in his sacrifice, be accepted? He brings the first fruits, the firstlings of his flock. Cain brings the first of his crops. They're bringing the same things from out of their... Why is one accepted and one not? So Cain and ourselves are unknowledgeable about the mysteries of God. The only insight there is, God says to Cain, if you live uprightly, then everything, you'll be accepted. Well, is Cain not living uprightly? We don't know anything else about Cain, except that he is the first son of Adam and Eve. He's the tiller of the soil. His sacrifice is rejected. He murders his brother. There's nothing else we know initially about Cain, except that one phrase. Does he feel privilege is being taken away? Because Abel exists. He is the firstborn. He was the only born. He is the only child in all of the earth, you could argue at one point. Now there's Abel. Instead of Abel being a brother, Abel seems to be a rival. Not a rival not only in God's sight, but a rival by simply being a brother. What I find really intriguing, if you look at all the siblings throughout all the scriptures, nobody gets along. Jacob and Esau are fighting in the womb as twins.
He explores that a little bit in the book, and this idea that, I don't want to misquote the book, but almost that siblings are not made to get along, that there's this innate sort of opposition, if you will, or envy. I don't know. We just keep coming back to envy. We're so unaware that envy plays such a strong role in dictating how we act and how we treat others?
I don't think we are as open to it and in reflecting on it. And what does advertising do? It banks on that difference. It banks on envy and jealousy. It's selling us things because you can have this and someone else doesn't. And when you buy this product, you're going to be better. Sense of privilege than someone who can't afford it or doesn't have it. It's interesting that all of those values, are part of our consumerist life, but we don't reflect on that. As you're watching television, listen to the terminology that's used, the vocabulary that's used in every commercial.
You can almost predict what they're.
You can almost predict. I've seen commercials that I don't even know what they're selling, but my life is going to be wonderful, better with this.
There's another phrase used a lot in the book, or a theme, or concept that I like, and it's tethered. This idea of being tethered to things, to other people. Did you pick up on that same theme? What do you think about it? What is this idea of being tethered?
Tethered is the idea of being, or the fact of being attached to someone. Mountain climbers are tethered to each other as they're going up Everest because it's for their safety. But also being tethered to someone else means I'm responsible for someone else. It means what happens to them can happen to me. What happens to me happens to them. Am I my brother's keeper? Yes, we are. Yes, we are.
You can see a lot of kind of modern theories wrapped into that, such as the individualism versus collectivism. It's in, I suppose, in the United States, especially, we're very individualistic, which I think makes these themes a little more relevant to us here.
Adam is not fully, I would even say, human until Eve is on the scene. And God created the human being. Male and female, God created them in the first creation story. In the second creation story, it's Adam, but he doesn't relate to any other creature. It's only when God, from his side, creates Eve that he has an equal partner. He has someone to walk with. We were not made to be solitary. We were not created to be individualistic. In our Christian revelation, we believe that God, to be God, is to be in relationship, Father, Son, and Spirit. That's what the doctrine of Trinity is about. It's about relationship. If to be God means to be in relationship, then to be creature, to be human means to be in relationship. That's different than being dependent in the bad way, in using people. But we need each other to be our fullest. I mean, how can I know who I am without getting any feedback from other people who care about me, friends, family? That coming back to me helps me understand who I am. It helps me carve out a better me.
I think another theme is we often hear or think about the God of the Old Testament as being this kind of vengeful, violent, maybe ruthless.
Mm-hmm. Oh, those are all
being.
good words.
But ultimately, he always ends up restoring dignity to those who have broken his law.
In the early centuries, there was probably a priest named Marcion who believed there was a God of the Old Testament and a God of the New Testament. They were two separate gods. A God who was, as you say, vengeful, punishing, to be feared, and Jesus taught about a God to love. The fact is, the whole scriptures talk about the same God. We see, even though there is a punishment for eating the fruit of the tree of good and evil, God does not take that punishment out on Adam and Eve. They do not die. They are expelled from the garden, but the very last thing God does is, one, clothe them with leather garments, not fig leaves, and two, makes a promise of a savior. When Cain murders, and his punishment of wandering, he says, is too great, God marks him that if anyone murders Cain, they will be punished 7 times what Cain's punishment is. When the serpents in the desert are biting the Israelites and they're dying, God has Moses make a bronze serpent. Whoever looks in the bronze serpent is healed. So all through what Marcion thinks is a God of vengeance, to be feared, of punishing, if we're really listening and reading, there is through this a God who, as you have said, pardons, is a God of life.
Well, and that's right where I'm going with this. Another passage from the book, and as you've already said, God marks him. Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. The mark is symbolic. It humanizes Cain. And thanks to this mark, Cain is no longer associated with murder. Did we just invent the pardon?
No, we did. God did. God is a God who saves. God is a God of life. And God calls forth life even from where there is death. Cain has murdered his brother. He's also, therefore, spiritually and psychologically, emotionally, murdered himself. God won't allow that.
How do we reconcile that then with our civic counterpart, which is the death penalty, which our social teaching says is inadmissible, and it's part of this kind of continuum of the right to life?
At one point, the church left death penalty up to the state. That was the state's job. That not necessarily that they carried it out, but Pope Francis has moved the moral compass, and that death penalty is immoral. The reason why he teaches that, and we've come to believe that, is one, if we're going to be pro-life, we need to be pro-life from the moment of conception to death. It means to support life. It doesn't mean to just be against abortion. It means to walk with women, often who have been abandoned by the guy. And not just to give birth, but to bring this child up. There's got to be more to it than that. That's why the issues of homelessness is part of this, and hunger is part of pro-life. So we come to the death penalty. Well, if the state executes someone, what you've also done is taken away from that person any possibility of redemption, of change. Cain changes. Cain wanders into the land of Nod. But then we find out he ends up being the father of civilization. He builds the first city. So out of the evil of that murder, the consequences of which is Cain's separation from the rest of humanity, an isolation that is he imposes on himself. God will not let that stand. And whatever happens in that wandering, Cain changes. And life is brought forth. He has a son, Enoch. He is the founder of civilization. And then the children of Enoch. You have Jabal, who is creates metalworks. Jubal is musicians. So all this life comes out of Cain that would not have happened if he was executed by God.
So often, though, we carry out those punishments in the name of God.
Mm-hmm. That's why theocracies are not healthy places. And when, especially our government, which is secular, we have a separation of church and state. To be anyone using God or manipulating the scriptures of any peoples for their own purposes is a very dangerous place to go.
Mm-hmm.
Can you make arguments, moral arguments, out of the values of a particular people's sacred writings? Yes, but you got to be very careful saying God's behind it, because we don't know. Whenever we think God is on our side, God is on no one's side. There's a wonderful story, or a midrash, of the Jews, and Israel has crossed the Red Sea, and the angels are dancing and singing, and God asks why. Well, your people Israel have crossed the Red Sea. They're safe. They're free from the slavery of Egypt. And God continues to ask, why are you dancing and singing? My children, the Egyptians, are dead. God is not on the side of Israel, nor on the side of Egypt. He's on the side of his children, and on the side of his children for life. And so God even mourns the death of the Egyptians while the Israelites are passing through the sea. That's a real challenging understanding of that story that I found absolutely wonderful. So God is not, whenever a government wants to say God is on our side, they need to be very careful. And religious teachers, moral teachers, in our case bishops, should stand up and be the corrective, be prophetic, and you can't claim God.
Right. And I think the other thing about stories like that is there's always, unfortunately, an abundance of examples that you can plug in to. So instead of, the Egyptians, you can plug in ABC.
Yep.
And
think of the situation of Ukraine right now. You have Russian Orthodox Christians, Ukrainian and Catholic and Orthodox Christians fighting each other. Whose side is God on?
Right.
These are supposedly two Christian nations. Well, nations aren't Christian, nations aren't Jewish, nations aren't Muslim. Be very, very careful of theocracies or of claiming that. For our history, the Crusades. Oh, God is on our side against the heathen Muslims in Jerusalem. Yet it was Christians from the West who probably murdered more Christians in conquering Jerusalem and Constantinople, etc. Whose side is God on? Oh, God is on the side of justice, and it's not our sense of justice, it's God's sense of justice that doesn't carry out the sentence of death to Adam and Eve, protects Cain, and the story goes on.
And there we go, trying to be God again.
Mm-hmm.
The last thing I wanted to talk about is the only part of the book where I think we kind of veer off into something different, and that is this idea, there's a lot of Freud in here.
Mm-hmm.
I don't particularly buy it, but it's there. And it's this kind of idea that Cain is jealous of mom, and that's why he has to kill Abel. And so my question was always, well, if he's jealous of mom and the relationship and the attachment, why not kill dad?
Well, I agree with you. I disagree with the Freudian read of this. That's the only
Seems a
place I
stretch.
really it seems a stretch, and I think it takes these ancient stories beyond. These are not stories of psychology. Though psychology is in it. The stories about God and God's relationship to humanity. That's fundamentally what these ancient stories are about. In one respect, I say, I mean, with siblings and whatnot, yeah, does mom and dad have a favorite? They may not, at least not consciously, but it may be read that way by other siblings. But that's still, I think, the Freud interpretation. In killing Abel, doesn't Cain also kill both parents? My experience over the years as a priest, to me, the most deepest pain is parents who have to bury their children. And it makes no difference how old their children are. I had an 80-year-old woman who had to bury a 50-year-old son. That 50-year-old son is her kid. It's just not infants or teenagers, and from mass shootings or accidents and things that are
Well, it's
young.
always the idea they should be the first.
They should be the first. That's the supposed wisdom. Having worked in Albany Medical Center, people would be surprised how many young people die. Now they're coming from a large area, but more young people die. But I think it's a depth of pain that no one should try and explain or touch. You simply walk with parents. And how often does a marriage end in divorce because of the death of a child? So in Cain murdering Abel, in one respect you could argue he's murdered his whole family. But the Freud reading, I think, is pushing a lot.
There's always there's been a take on this story that Abel is the preferred one because that's the one that God chooses to take his crops. And I thought I always wanted to flip that. And is Cain misunderstanding what God is doing in that moment? Is God choosing Abel only because he thinks Abel needs it? Abel needs that affirmation. And Cain's the stronger brother, so he doesn't need my attention. It's the same way how you talked about, like a parent having a favorite. Sometimes one child gets a little bit more attention than the other simply because they need it.
That is an absolutely intriguing interpretation. I think it's a valid interpretation. We know nothing about Abel. All we know is Abel is the second child of Adam and Eve. He is a shepherd, and he goes to offer sacrifice, and he offers the firstlings of the flock. It's all we know about the guy. And see, that's what's wonderful about these ancient stories. There's a lot of space in between the lines to fill in, to allow different interpretations. And is that correct? That Cain is the stronger, Abel needed more attention? No one deserves to die. I don't care what they did. No one's... Think about Brian Thompson, who was murdered, United Healthcare. Whatever he stands for in people's minds, whatever he was responsible for in healthcare, no one deserves to be premeditated and murdered. Period. That's an intriguing interpretation. It's a good possibility. Cain or Abel needs to be cared for. God needs to support him a little bit more because Cain doesn't need it, and Cain just doesn't see it. He has everything already. It's like the prodigal sons. It's not son, it's sons. The younger son needs more. The older son stays home. He does what dad wants of him, but he gets jealous because he doesn't realize what he's had. The father says, "You have everything of mine, but your brother was lost." And that's why we need to celebrate. It's the same story. It's the same story.
And I think about Cain, when you want to talk about being the preferred one, if you will. God's talking to you. We don't know that he had any communication with Abel or had that any sort of relationship. All we know is that this one time he was chosen for this thing. And, we can speculate as to whether he was quote unquote weaker one and just needed the attention and so on. But, Cain's the one in direct dialogue with God.
I wouldn't call that speculation. I think that's what it means to reflect on the scriptures. And that's where the Spirit gives us insights. And that's why it's important not just to read the Bible. Stay with the passage for a while. Keep thinking it over and mulling it over in your mind. What is the insight here the Spirit wants to say to maybe a person individually, to a community, to the church as a whole? So it's more than just speculation. It's being open to what the Spirit is always trying to say to whomever. And that's going to change. It's multifaceted because of a situation. So a number of people, because of their particular situations in life, are going to reflect on the story of Cain and Abel and come away with very, very different interpretations, all of which are valid, all of which are from the Spirit, because that interpretation is for them in their particular place in life.
Well, I think that's a good place to end, is to invite people to pick up a copy of the book, read it, sit with it, interpret it for themselves, read the scripture that kind of goes along with it, and do the same thing. And we might be completely wrong about everything we've said here.
I can't imagine that, but we just might.